We're going to invite up our speaker today, David Solomon, the adopted son, or sole son of Paul Solomon, who continues Paul's work in a very earnest way while dealing with his own physical challenges. But he keeps going. He's a wonderful testimonial to just that power of conviction in God, in the teachings that we have, and that what he has to share is meant for others. And his experience is a tool meant for others that God is using. So let us bring up David.
You know, I always try to figure out whether I'm going to wear my robe or wear a suit or put on a bathrobe. I said, well, since I mostly do the robe thing, I'll continue that tradition here. So I'm one of the few pastors that do that since I have one and done it. So it's kind of my Christian foundation, my faith, even though I'm an Eastern Buddhist Zen kind of guy. So this morning's talk is actually going to focus on 5 Catholic saints and one other experience that is not Catholic. And that's why the title of the talk today, Have You Kissed a Leper Today? Which is an unusual title, and you're probably wondering, what the heck does he mean by that? And by the way, I'm not Tom Baker today. I have a little bit more hair than him, but some of you were expecting Tom. He had a double booking, and they called me just a few days ago to put this together, and so I was happy to speak. I'm going to talk this morning about real lepers. Lepers who have the repulsing, disfiguring, horrible welts on their body. You know, it's almost genetic. When we see them, we almost recoil. It's so horrible looking that most people tend to shy away from them. Lepers were made kind of famous. If you remember the movie Ben-Hur, where at the end of the movie, Ben-Hur's family was underneath the cross, and the blood was dripping down from the crucifixion and fell upon them, and they were healed by the blood from his cross. So it's still a movie, but it was very moving, and we kind of think about lepers maybe in that way. I mean, how many of you have actually ever seen a leper? They don't come out. They stay still hidden in hospitals and their homes. We're also going to talk about metaphorical lepers. Beggars, homeless, and the poor. We got 6 stories to talk about today. Men and women who met Christ face to face by taking a risk, because that's a part of what this talk is about today, about taking risks, kissing a leper. I mean, how many of us would really do that? Right? Well, we have a pope, current Pope, Pope Francis. Many of you may not know this. You saw in the news last year, he was giving a catechism, which is a talk to the Christian faithful in St. Peter's Square. And after his talk, he hops into his Pope-mobile. You know how he's got that Pope-mobile with the bulletproof windows, and he's driving down the streets of Rome, and he's looking into the crowd, and he sees this disfigured man. He was a leper. This is like the President of the United States. You just don't get out of the Pope-mobile. So he gets out of the Pope-mobile and he walks over to the leper. He hugs him and he kisses him. And it was a beautiful national moment. He didn't even think of himself. Don't you love this current Pope? Yeah. I mean, he's talking and supporting. He says, I can't judge gays. Well, maybe we should look at contraception again. Let's call the Italian mafia for what they are. Let's look at 2% of the pedophiles that are in the Catholic Church. That Pope is taking a risk and continues to take a risk. That's his way of kissing a leper, both literally and figuratively. He's changing the hearts of 1.2 billion Catholics today. They're starting to think about things differently. There was another leper incident that you probably all know about. St. Francis of Assisi is probably the most famous story. If you've seen the movie Brother, Sun, and Sister Moon, it's basically how the man's life was changed. It's a situation where he approached the leper by being on horseback. He was on the pathway back from the war in Assisi and saw the leper on the road, and of course, being the former playboy that he was, a rich kid, decided to get off the horse. What made him do it? Perhaps pity, but he actually got off the horse, gave the leper a coin, kissed him, hugged him, and it changed him. He started a hospice for lepers. That was the beginning of his ministry. And what happened was he had a dream subsequent to that first meeting with that leper. And the dream was that the leper was actually Jesus Christ on the road. That somehow he disguised himself. And it was a teaching lesson for St. Francis. And of course, St. Francis after that started the Franciscan order, which continues to this day, with tens of thousands of followers who believe in humility and poverty to do their work for the poor and those astray. We read to you the story about Jesus healing the 10 lepers, and the point of the story is where 10 were healed 2,000 years ago of leprosy by their faith, 9 would not approach him afterwards because of their respect for the law of Moses, but their fear of approaching, because it was still part of their consciousness about how to handle their leprosy. And I say that just because later in our story this morning, we're going to talk about that, because that's important. Another example in the Catholic Church happened just a few hundred years after Christ died. Have you ever heard of St. Martin of Tours? Anybody have heard that name? Well, St. Martin was a wealthy Bulgarian officer. His father served in the Roman army. His family still worshipped the Greek gods. But it was Martin's own spiritual hunger that led him at 10 years old to knock on Christian doors. Because at that point, around 316 AD, Christians were not being burned at the stake or cooked over a stove for their Christianity. It was actually becoming a mainstream religion. And at 10 years old, he decided to become a Christian. And it was back then he was called a catechumen. He was unbaptized, but he was still forced to join the army at 15 years old after that. But he secretly still wanted to be a monk. In fact, they had to hold him in chains before he would give the military oath to serve, which he finally did. But like his father, he eventually became an officer, but he still wanted to live the life of a monk. One day, he was wearing his army regalia and his uniform, nice gold armor outfit, silver helmet, and he was riding through the city streets of Rome, and he rode to the gate and he saw this beggar at the gate, a man that was hardly clothed. He was shivering in the cold. And as the story goes, St. Martin took out his sword and sliced his cloak in half and gave the beggar the other half of his robe. Now, that was a point in his life where he did not know what had happened, but that evening he had a dream that he was looking at the man, the beggar in the dream, and Jesus stepped forward and said, "You didn't know that was me, did you?" And that dream and that situation transformed St. Martin's life, and he became known as St. Martin of Tours. And what we probably don't know is that the word chaplain actually comes from what he did. Chaplains and the word chapel comes from St. Martin of Tours and his work of cutting the cloak in half and meeting Christ there at the city gates. We're going to jump around a little bit. Around 1073, about 700 years later, there was another man. His name was John Gualbert, also known as a Christian saint. He was the son of a wealthy noble. Yeah, all these guys always seem wealthy. All these saints don't start out poor. They become wealthy and then they choose poverty. He witnessed the assassination and murder of his young brother when he was in his teens. And he was a gentleman in Italy at the time, and the man seemed beyond the laws at the time. But he found this guy. He tracked him. He tracked the murderer up high in the mountains of Vallombrosa. Had a narrow cliff area, a pathway, confronted him, said, "You killed my brother, and it's your time to die." He raised his sword to slash him, and immediately before he could do so, the man spread out his hands like the Christ and said, "Dear sir, please forgive me," and begged for his life. He dropped his sword, fell on his knees, lifted him up, and said, "Any man who asks in Christ's name for forgiveness, I will forgive." He did not intend to forgive the man. Can you imagine your own brother, your own daughter being murdered and handling it that way and forgiving them? That's what he did. That night, St. Gualbert had a dream. He was looking at a crucifix in the dream, and the crucifix of Jesus bowed his head toward him and nodded, and it was like Jesus had come alive in the cross. And if you have those kind of dreams, those are very different than regular dreams because it transformed his life. He also started an order, and the order of forgiveness. In fact, he has a famous saying, a motto that says, "He who cannot forgive others destroys a bridge which he himself must pass, for every man is in need of forgiveness." It's a great one to remember. So John Gilbert kissed the leper disguised as hate and revenge, and took a risk to let go and forgive the killer and his beloved brother. It changed his life, and we have a new order that still exists today. Even Galileo attended that order when he was around 1600. There's a modern story, and some of you may have known her. It's kind of a sister story to Mother Teresa. Her name was Sister Emmanuel. Anybody have ever heard of Sister Emmanuel? She's kind of actually second to Mother Teresa in the ranks of Catholicism as far as saints go. She just died a few years ago in 2008 of being 99 years old. But this is her story of kissing the leper. She was a French nun, and 50 years ago, she was facing early retirement at 63, but was discouraged about what to do with the rest of her life. She was not ready to retire and wanted to do something. I want to make a difference. She prayed, "God, what do you want me to do with my life?" We all do that. What do you want to do with my life? Then she heard about the Zebuli, the garbage collectors of Cairo, Egypt, the kids in the city of garbage. There were 11 of them in Egypt. Well, back then, in 1963, it was just the kids, the poor, and the adults collecting garbage in wooden wheelbarrows. There were no trucks back then that collected garbage daily. It was the kids that were doing it. And the kids would bring the garbage back to this dump outside the suburbs of Cairo and dump these mountains of garbage. There are 9 million people in Egypt, in Cairo, Egypt. They produce 14,000 tons of garbage a day. These kids collect 4,200 tons of that garbage now. You imagine, get a picture in your mind, 4,200 100 tons of garbage being built every day. In fact, the garbage is so high that it covers 10-story buildings. It's that high. And these kids, in their abstract poverty, in their dirtiness with the rats and the dogs and their poverty, go do this. And they do this to make a living. Anyway, Sister Emmanuel immediately realized that God had answered her prayers when she heard about the Zebulun. She asked her superiors in Rome for permission to live out her life in Egypt. He said, if you please, I'm a little old. I just want to help the poor. I want to go to one of the most wretched places on earth. I want to help those who are desperate. I want to make a difference. So she got on a plane. See, that's what you do when you kiss the leper. You just do it. You don't think about it, you just do it. So she flew directly to Cairo, went to Egypt to live. She didn't go get a comfortable quarters to live in. She went right to the dumps. Now, the largest city is called Makkatim. It's a suburb of Egypt. Her friends warned her, you can't go into that area. Even the police won't go into that area. It's very dangerous. You'll be stabbed. They will knife you. You will be killed. You're 63 years old. You're an old lady. You cannot survive in such a place. But she went there anyway. And the first thing she did was pick up a stick and began scratching letters in the dirt for the kids, for the filthy kids of Makkatim. These children had never been to school because they never had time to go to school. They were working to go out and collect, sift, and go through garbage to make a living. She got them curious by telling them that what these letters meant, the English letters that she taught. She did not know Arabic. So she made a little school. But first, they helped her by getting cardboard to cover the dirt floor and gathered tin to cover her. So she made a little tin shack for her very first night. Instead of hurting her, they helped her. Because you see, they didn't see her as a rescue worker coming to help and lord over them. They saw her as maybe one of them. She told her friends, I have to do it this way. They begged her to still leave. She said, I have to affirm people's lives as they are. I can't look like I'm better than them. But she moved into the shack, and they respected her charity and her love. They protected her so that she would not be killed and robbed. She dealt with dealing with the rats that would walk and run through her shack every night, the dogs that would try to break in and steal her food. And she took a bath every day by pouring water over her head. She had none of the luxuries of what she just left Rome about. Her hope was with the children. She hoped to help them someday so that they could move out of the dump and live a somewhat normal life. She felt she was not as strong as Mother Teresa, but she instructed the kids on reading, writing, and arithmetic. She did not teach them religion because the Muslims and the Christians, we don't want to separate them. And she taught birth control. In fact, she had to write the Pope back then that she was doing that. He never responded to her. But he did anyway. She did it anyway. It wasn't easy at first. She only received $6 a month from Rome. Not for her, but to help the kids. And she never could get anything done. So she went to Washington, Canada, London, Paris, and Belgium to raise money. She didn't really want charity. She wanted justice. She felt like you can't have a luxurious life, and all over the world, children are dying. In fact, in Geneva, she said, if you don't give me the money, I'm going to do a holdup. She was serious. But apparently, it wasn't necessary. Using gumption and spiritual force, she raised $1 million. And today, Zebulun, in the village of Palms, one of the 11 cities of garbage, they have a 6-story building called Salem, Peace, which means peace. a center, a kindergarten for 200, an elementary school, a high school, a dispensary, a dentist clinic, a vocational center for sewing, plumbing, carpentry, and electricity, and 2 soccer fields. That's what one lady with a stick who kissed a leper and overcame her fear made a difference. After 11 years of the first city, she decided to do it all over again in city number 2 and spent a total of 20 years in the dumps before she ended up retiring in France in the late 90s and then passing away in 2008. She kissed the leper, the leper of rats, dogs, tin shack, trash, and threats to her life. Her bravery improved and saved countless lives in the garbage dumps of Cairo. Let's move forward to 1980. In September 1980, just a year after I began studying and traveling with Paul Solomon, he suggested that I move to New York City and spend a few years studying everything you can imagine. It was basically Tai Chi, journalism, speed reading, memory, business, stenography even. I was the only guy in a class of 50. Typing, one of the most valuable things I ever learned. When we first arrived, in fact, I had a student friend, Andrew Schaefer, who was with me, and we studied together. We got up at 5 o'clock every morning, and we did these disciplines every day. We did journal work every day. We recorded our dreams every day, and then we went to work. One of us worked while one of us studied, and then we switched off after 6 months, and one of us studied while one of us worked. I even grew alfalfa sprouts under my bed to raise money. Now, in that little apartment, which really was a converted hotel, every time we turned the lights on, roaches scampered away around the stove. It was those old New York buildings, and if you've ever been there, they're just full of them. But I tried to keep that place clean. But anyway, one day when Andrew was at work, I decided I'm going to take a walk down Broadway. If you know New York, 110th and Broadway was kind of out there on the outskirts. So I'm walking down the sidewalk, and I thought I'd do a little experiment because I was feeling really happy that day, and I thought, I'm going to do what Paul asked me to do. Most people are serious, mature adults, and if you've ever seen anybody walking down the sidewalk with a smile on their face, there's got to be something wrong with them, right? They must be on drugs. What's wrong with that guy? So, in New York, it's a city of 9 million serious people who got to get to a business meeting. No one will, stop. You smile at them, and they're like, what's wrong with him? So I'm here, I'm 22 years old, and I'm practicing. I'm going to do this. And I'm a type A personality. I'm serious. I don't smile a lot. I smiled more when I was younger, but I got too serious. I'm trying to reverse that now. Yeah. So anyway, I'm walking down the sidewalk, and I'm starting to smile at people, and no one's smiling back at me. And I get down to about 92nd Street. There were fruit stands and vegetable stands, if you know New York City, on every other corner there. So I thought, well, maybe I'll get some fruit and some vegetables, and I'll just walk across the street. And I noticed as I was walking across the street, there was an African-American woman leaning against the brick building next to the fruit stand. She had a little tissue out, and she was wiping her nose. And she had a little cart in front of her, and it was obviously she was a bag lady. All her possessions in the world were in that cart. And so I gave her a big smile. And she smiled back. So I'm walking to the sidewalk, and I'm kind of walking up towards the fruit stand, and I look back, and she had come out into the middle of the sidewalk, and she was still nodding and smiling at me. And all of a sudden, this explosive million-volt current hit me, literally knocked me down to my knees in the sidewalk, and I started bawling. I didn't even know what was going on. And I thought, oh my God, what's happening? And I looked at her, and I'm bawling, and she's just not approaching me. She's just looking at me, nodding and like this, and I'm going, I felt like one of the 9 lepers that didn't go back to her and say thank you. I was just too caught off guard by the experience. So after about 5 minutes, she walks back to her brick wall. I didn't know what to do. I'm still, like, my body's tingling. It was almost scary because I wanted to go see her, but I was scared to go up to her. It was like I wasn't, like, hug her or something. So I just walked back to my apartment and I wrote it in my journal. So Paul Solomon visited me 2 weeks later in New York, and I told him about this experience. I said, I heard about, the old scripture that, beware for the strangers you meet, lest you come upon an angel unaware. And I said, was that an angel? He said, no, that was Jesus Christ. Only Jesus can do that to you. It was 30 years later that I had an experience, an encounter that was like that, even more powerful, that I've talked about in a previous service in October of 2011, and I want to talk about that a little bit, but first I need to preface that with a little story. You see, that was 35 years ago in New York. And now, my own little kissing of the leper is my own cancer, which I was diagnosed 13 months ago. It's a terminal brain cancer called glioblastoma multiforme. It's the worst you can get. The unusual circumstances around it are that my wife's mother died of the same disease, and my best friend, Paul Riccioppo, some of you know, died of the same disease. It's extremely rare. Only 12,000 people a year contract this kind of cancer. Average lifespan is 14 to 18 months, and I'm 13 months into my diagnosis. I've never been afraid of death. Not once. I don't wake up in the middle of the night and go, oh my God, I'm going to die. I've never had that since I never had it really anyway, but, there's a difference between not being afraid of death and wanting to live. Being resigned to death and wanting to live. And I think I did a pretty good job. I got into writing my book called The Dead Saints Chronicles, which I was in the middle of the project before I got this cancer. But one of the things that happened just before I found out, on June 13th, 2013, just over a year ago, is that I was in my home in Washington State and I had this premonition that I was going to die. I fell down on my knees and I don't know where it came from. I just knew this was going to happen. And I said, God, if I'm going to pass, just give me 3 years. I said, I want to see my daughter Angela graduate high school. I just said it out loud. I had no information, no data, no symptoms that would tell me this event was coming up in 3 weeks. So the reason I mention that is because, sometimes I did want to run away and hide during this time in the last year. Everybody, all of you, have given me so many wonderful options for cancer cures. But sometimes it became like trying to snort shark fin. Cancer cure. Everybody's got their cure, and it's wonderful, but, I've got a list this long, and sometimes, if you ever read that new book out called The Fault in the Stars, another story about cancer, you sort of get jaded to it. It's like, oh, another cure, roll your eyes kind of thing. I'm doing what I can, but Lord. But thank you.
I'm a healer.
Well, this is coming up too. But the remarkable part of the story, just 7 weeks ago on June 6th, I had a remarkable dream. I dreamed I was climbing down from a very high oak tree. And when I got to the bottom of the oak tree, on the ground, I was sort of in a farm setting, I was a part of this group that was having discussion about whether this white stallion who was lying on the ground in the farm had lost its will to live. Now the stallion wasn't standing up, it was lying on the ground. So we're having this discussion. Well, do we feed the stallion and keep the stallion living, or do we pay this 3-year lease on a car? See about the dream about asking for 3 years? So I said, wait a minute. I put up my hand and I say, hey, I have a say-so in this. I think the horse should be fed and the horse should live. So what I did was I knelt down beside the horse, this beautiful white stallion, and I looked down, and instead of this black-brown pupil in its eye, I can only see one because it was lying on its side, there was this beautiful white light, brilliant white light streaming from the horse's eye. I'd never seen a light like that in my entire life. So I began petting the horse's head ever so gently, as if I would pet a child. And I said, buddy, you can make it. You can live. Come on, buddy, you can do it. And I spoke ever so gently to this horse. And then I woke up. Now the dream's pretty obvious. The horse was me. The light is God within me, the Christ within me. And I'm encouraging my own will to live. You see, it's not so obvious. It is a kiss of the leper that is not so obvious to choose to live versus being resigned to die. Not that I don't believe in miracles, but this is one of those cancers where those who live 3 years are like way less than 1%. It's a pretty devastating type of tumor. So the story goes on. You see, from that point, after the dream, I had been avoiding Judith Van Cleve's Kangen water, as it was one of those snortfin things again. Snortfin remedies. I said, all right, I'll do the water. pH yourself into oblivion. I'd ask Duke about it. They think it's mumbo jumbo, but okay, I'm going to try that. I'm going to start exercising. I have a pool in my courtyard, so I start swimming every day, laps in the pool. It's there. It's 82 degrees. Might as well use it. Instead of just lying around waiting to die. Yeah. So, did that. Did a 3-day fast with Lynn. And she's been pushing me to go to another healer, an Episcopalian priest just down the road. And she's been chasing me 2 months, and I've been avoiding it because I've had enough of the healing stuff. It's embarrassing to me sometimes. You just get in a group and don't want to be the center of attention. So anyway, we go down to 39th Street to the Grace Bible. Grace? Which one is it? Galilee Church, where he kind of reserves a room. His name is Nigel Mumford, and he was the gentleman that does the laying on of hands healing. He's got a reputation. So, all right, I'm going. So we go and walk into his wonderful little office in the back, and Nigel and I start talking, and of course he's being a counselor first, finding out information, and then I told him about my book, about near-death studies, and he kind of jaw dropped and said, well, I've had 5 near-death experiences. This is an Episcopalian priest with the white collar, he's telling me, I've had 5 of these experiences, and the last one, they led me the last rites to. I mean, he really was that close to death, but he felt that from his near-death experiences, he brought back the light and his healing power, and that's what he does now. That's what his ministry is. And he can barely breathe and barely walk from his injuries, from his accidents that caused him such a problem. And he told me, he said, David, we can heal you, and however you may have brain damage and other things that still keep you from being a normal person, just like I have, but you still go on. You still do your ministry. He said, don't, I was surprised to even hear this from an Episcopalian priest. He said, in Australia, the witch doctors there have what they call a bony finger of death. It's actually like the bones. And he said, when they pointed at somebody and they they make a curse. It's 100% deadly. The government knows it. People know it. He said, don't do that to yourself. Don't take those bony fingers of death and point it at your tumor and stop calling it a tumor. Call it a thing. So we did that. He did his wonderful laying on hands healing. He did anointing with oil. Gave me some, wonderful cloths. He said, haven't you ever heard of praying over your medicine? They're like little angels. Give them purpose. So here's some cloths, and I taped them to my medicine bottles. So that when they go in, they do their work, because that's what I still have to take chemo. It's a pill form every 5 days of the month. So, we had a wonderful session, and we're going to stay in contact, and I'm going to interview. He's going to be in one of the chapters toward the end of my book, because that's pretty cool. But the thing that was really even cooler was my very first answer to my prayer. When I cried out to God in 1979, I said, God, what do I do with my life? I knocked on the door of the 37th Street ashram off of Pacific Avenue, just 300 feet away from where I visited Nigel. And when I realized that the next day, I cried out to God and I said, how could this be that where I started my work, I'm going to resurrect my life? You see, that's how God works. It gets weirder. Lots of those. I went to Joy Talley on Paul's birthday on July 7th. Now, I'd only known Joy about 6 months. But remember that incident that I told you about in 2011 where I had a visitation by the Christ by reading a near-death experience? It was actually from a just off-the-wall choice of looking at a blog on a near-death site in 2011 about this man's face-to-face experience of meeting Jesus. And what happened was he was on the operation table and they were trying to save him from cancer. He had a fistula, an open hole in his lung from his cancer operation. They were trying to save his life because it's just as deadly as the cancer. And during the operation, he started talking under deep anesthesia. And then he died. So the doctors were in the corner of the room and they're huddling, praying for him. One of them looks over and sees that he's come back to life. And they said, oh my God, he's alive! And they rush over and they patch him up and put him back together. And finally the surgeons leave and there's one surgeon left. And he says, you wonder why I'm standing here? And he said, yeah, Doc, why are you standing there? He said, well, because you were talking under anesthesia. Well, what's the big deal about that? He says, it's not that you were talking, which is highly unusual, but it's who you were talking to. And he said, well, who was I talking to? He said, you mentioned Jesus Christ by name several times. Oh, okay, that's weird. But anyway, so he goes home, and then he goes back to Virginia Beach, and he visits a psychic who tells him, well, I know the other side of the conversation the doctors didn't hear. He said, you're going to now live another 26 years. You were supposed to die on that operation table. But what happened was, you were so upset about dying that you went and yelled in front of Jesus without even knowing who he was and said, I want to live. Damn it. And Jesus started laughing, apparently, and said, okay, well, we're going to heal you, and you're going to do some great work. You're going to start helping people. So he actually starts getting better. But the reason I mention this story is because I just found this blog out of the blue, and it mentioned the psychic in Virginia Beach, and she was in her early 70s, 10 years ago in 2004. Fast forward to 2014. January 1st, Bruce Shelton invites me to his house, and we're having a little New Year's party, and we're sitting at the dining room table, and this 83-year-old woman was sitting right in front of me. And I'm looking, I didn't know her, I've never seen Joy before. So she starts just doing a reading for me. I haven't even asking questions. She says, David, get off your pity pot. Have you forgiven Paul? Have you forgiven your dad? and she tells me all this stuff, and I'm looking at her like, lady, who in the heck are you? Do you really know me? So, and I kind of like, in my head, I'm putting dots together. Is she the psychic Joy Talley? Are you Joy Talley? Yes, I am. I said, oh, okay. And then we had talk, but that was just weird, because then in my mind, well, aren't you the lady that did the reading for the guy that saw Jesus face to face? She goes, yep. I said, oh, that is so cool. I said, I need the name of that guy because I need to interview him for my book. So, well, I don't have the name with me. So, fast forward back to July 7th. That was the reason why I went to see her. I didn't go to get a reading. I needed to get the name of this guy. But she gave me a reading anyway. And she says I'm going to live until I'm in my 60s. So, she said, my world's turning green now. And all. It's wonderful. That would be a miracle too. But let me tell you the final miracle here before I end. Her secretary, Joy's secretary, gave me the name of the man who had the experience. His name is Chris Reeves. He's writing a book on his own near-death experience. He lives up in Massachusetts and works for the VA Medical Center as a psychologist. He's still alive. I got his number and I called him. We were like two brothers, like two peas in a pod. We're already sharing our book stuff. And guess what? He's got a job offer to move down here to Virginia Beach to the VA Medical Center in Virginia Beach where I get my blood tests. Now, how weird is that? And what he wants to do with me is to start talking in other churches and states about our experiences, because his book is called Meeting Jesus Face to Face. And it's my experience. So, one last note I want to say. Find a leper to kiss. Forgive a killer. Give up half your cloak. Squat in a tin shack. Help some kids. Choose to live. Smile at a homeless person. But more than that, go sit with them for a few minutes and find out who they are. Don't just give them money and be afraid to talk to them. It happens to me a lot, I'll admit it. You know, I've dealt a lot with homeless people. But they're people too. Look into their eyes and know the brilliant light of Jeshua Christos. Jeshua meaning salvation. Christos meaning Messiah or anointed one. And know that even though the light is dim in their eyes, they're waiting for you to make the first step to kiss the leper and change the world. Maranatha.